Because there's a difference between deciding and doing. Okay? And this is the problem I see with Malaysia. Malaysia has too many plans and policies. Malaysia doesn't, we know what needs to be done in this country. And it's really the doing part, the implementation part that really needs to be focused on.
Okey, selamat kembali ke episod ke-67 Keluar Sekejap. Seperti mana yang kita janjikan tadi, kita ada tetamu khas pada hari ini untuk membincangkan terutamanya isu-isu ekonomi, dan perbincangan ini sudah pasti adalah satu perbincangan yang sangat dinantikan oleh Kian Meng, Syaril dan saya sebagai orang-orang yang minat dalam bidang ekonomi. Dan sudah pasti pendengar juga nak tahu juga pandangan daripada luar, pandangan daripada pakar berkenaan dengan isu-isu ekonomi, sama ada isu struktural ataupun isu semasa ekonomi. Cuma saya minta izin kepada pendengar dan penonton Keluar Sekejap sebab untuk segmen ini we have to switch into English, because our guest speaks English, and that is Apurva Sanghi, lead economist for the World Bank in Malaysia, Ketua pakar ekonomi untuk Bank Dunia di Malaysia. Welcome, Apurva.
Thank you, Khairi.
Yeah, thank you for coming.
Pleasure to be here.
Untuk makluman, for the benefit of our listeners, Apurva was previously in Kenya and also Russia, where he had a similar role as what he has here in Malaysia. He has a postgraduate degree, PhD degree from the University of Chicago, if I'm not mistaken.
That's right.
In the economics of climate change. So I'm not sure whether you are a full paid member of the Chicago School.
I hope
not. We'll find out. We're about to find out. And we can explain to our listeners what that's all about. Apurva, before we delve into some of the structural current issues about Malaysia's economy and perhaps locating that within global economic issues, let's go to basics here. What is the World Bank? Because for a lot of Malaysians, the World Bank brings with it a lot of connotations. It's a Bretton Woods institutions, Washington consensus. It's this thing which likes to control people with the IMF. And politicians who are under the thumb of the World Bank and the IMF tend to like to raise interest rates and things like that. I mean, this is the popular perception. So, Apurva, are you this secret society bringing about new global order, wanting to control developing countries and less developed countries?
So thanks for the question, Khairi and Sharil. Nice to be in the podcast. Before I begin, let me say that the last two podcasts you've had TMJ, you've had Tun Mahathir, and obviously the ratings were not high enough for you guys that you got a World Bank economist to be here, right? So, anyway, jokes apart, thanks for the invite. So listen, the World Bank, I mean, all that you said is partly true, partly perception, partly not, right? So we are a Bretton Woods institution. We were associated with structural adjustment loans in the past, but we are an institution that constantly keeps reinventing ourselves. So the phrase I like using is that development is a game of snakes and ladders. And we do not have the ultimate say in how development in a country occurs. The most we can do is to advise governments, but ultimately it's up to them what they want to do with that advice. And in the case of Malaysia, we do not lend any money to Malaysia. So you had mentioned my previous roles in Kenya, for example, where I was overseeing 4 countries where we had lending. So Africa, for example, needs our money. Malaysia does not because it's at a upper income, middle income sort of status. So what we do in Malaysia is we provide policy advice, technical assistance to the best of our abilities, tailored and customized to Malaysia as much as we possibly can. So I guess to conclude, I would say we like taking facts, evidence, analysis, and spreading them as widely as possible.
I personally have enjoyed watching you. I know we're friends and we have a
We have Bob
relationship
Dylan
of
in
friendship,
common.
and we have Dylan in common and cricket fandom.
And cricket.
But all that aside, you mentioned how World Bank is reinventing itself. I've noticed, I don't know, KJ, if you've noticed, Apurva is one of the most active economic commentators on X, previously known as Twitter. I wonder if that's something that you've done deliberately in your personal capacity, or is that something that the World Bank is doing throughout its engagements?
So I guess it's a bit of both. So if you look at my Twitter account, I make the claim that these are my personal views, but I am an economist with the World Bank, right? So that affiliation is definitely there. And I do sometimes, I guess you could say, go out on a limb and say things, but there's a reason for that, Charles. I think one of the things I'd like to make a distinction is this confusion between clients and counterparts. Okay, This is something that I give advice to young ones interested in the development business, those joining the World Bank. Sometimes, admittedly, even my own colleagues in the World Bank confuse it too. It's a long answer, but I'll get to the point. So counterparts are the government counterparts we work with, whereas our clients are the citizens of the country we are active in. In this case, in the case of Malaysia, our clients are the rakyat, right? And the counterparts are ways we engage with government bodies to improve the well-being of the rakyat. So there's a difference between counterparts and clients. And what I find interesting about social media in particular these days, and X formerly known as Twitter, is that there's a direct interface with the rakyat, with our clients. So that's why I'm out there, because I think it's really important for us to share our views, to share my views, and to have a direct interface with ultimately why we're here, which is to improve the well-being of the client.
Apurva, just back to the World Bank. People would like to also find out a little bit more about the governance of the bank. So who owns this bank? Do countries pay this bank a subscription every year to be part of the community of nations? Who runs the bank? I was told that the president of the World Bank customarily comes from the United States, and the MD of the IMF comes from Europe, and so this sounds like it's a bank that is led by a leadership from the United States, has a disproportionate voice and influence on the agenda of the World Bank. Maybe you can explain that a bit.
Sure. So let me explain to you on two fronts. On the personal front, my personal experience, I've been with the World Bank over 20 years, since 2000, and I've sort of seen it all in many ways, worked in many different parts of the World Bank, and under the governance structure. So the way, in simple words, is that we are owned by the countries that pay in sort of shares to the World Bank, right? So we are owned by the countries we work for. And the US happens to be the largest shareholder. So that is a fact, right? Now this perception that we are run by the US, by the Americans and this and that, this is where, let me just share with you my personal experience. I'm a humble lead economist, so I'm not at that level in the World Bank hierarchy. But the 22, 23 years I've been in the bank, not once have I felt any pressure, any political pressure to take one view or the other. So as I said, at least in my role, what I've always been encouraged to do, and which I, with no holds barred, is to take evidence, facts, analysis, and make them viral, spread them. So that's my answer to you, Kerry.
Kevin?
Can I ask something that's maybe a bit more technical but good for some of our audience to know? There's a program called Young Professionals Leaders Program for the World Bank under the age of 35. You want to say a little bit more about that and maybe how Malaysians can aspire to apply for this program?
Yeah, so there are many ways of joining the World Bank, and the best way, or the most popular way in some ways, is this YP, the Young Professional Program. And we take applicants and applications from around the world, and these are typically masters, PhD graduates with some work experience from all walks of life. They don't have to be economists. You can be an anthropologist, you can be a sociologist, and the whole idea is it's extremely competitive, right? But it offers you a sort of a structured way of joining the World Bank and then moving up the ladder, so to speak. So when I joined the World Bank, I was an OP. I was an old professional. I had missed the deadline because I was in the private sector before joining the bank. So I joined it at a mid sort of career.
Kari, one of our friends is actually YP at the World Bank, Marcus Lee from Oxford. I'm not sure whether you remember him.
Marcus. Yes.
So there are Malaysians there. Just wanted to highlight that.
Yes, very much so, yeah. And Kari, just going back to your question on, you said that the president of the World Bank is customarily appointed by the US, etc. Again, that is true, and same with the IMF, but I think that is changing as well. So what you have seen, at least what I've seen in the last few transitions, that post is becoming increasingly contested. So now anybody from around the world can announce a candidacy. There are interviews, so on and so forth. So I think you see much more contestability, and maybe I'm a bit biased, but I'm proud to say that our current president, even though he holds an American passport, he's of Ajay Banga.
Yes,
no, he's of Indian origin. He proudly calls himself as made in India, which really resonates with me. So
just a last point on this governance issue and the leadership of the World Bank, since I'm interested in these kind of things, Apurva. And I understand you're a lead economist, and I don't want you to cross the line, so to speak. But yes, the post of the president of the World Bank is increasingly more competitive. People can apply for it. But it's still subject to the realpolitik of global politics. I think that's something we have to accept. Do you think in our lifetime we can see a president from the global south, proper global south, as in a citizen of the global south?
I'm optimistic. Again, I'm not saying it just because I'm a man of the institution, but I've seen how contestable the post is getting with each transition. And I think it's not if, but when. That is my hope. I'm optimistic about it.
We want to quickly get into the Malaysia story and your observations. But maybe one bit before that, you mentioned about how your role is to bring evidence and data to your council, to your counterparts, in this case, the government of Malaysia. How receptive has the Malaysian government been? Point one. Question number two is, one of the criticisms about the World Bank or institutions like the World Bank is that, yes, you're driven by evidence and data of a certain sort, but do you fully appreciate the local politics and local reality? So two-part question.
So both great questions, Charles. So on the first one, so let me just benchmark my my experience in my previous post, which was Russia. So I was in Russia for 5 years, where I have to say, partly due to culture, partly due to language, access to policymakers wasn't that straightforward. Right? And we still had access to the Central Bank of Russia, MOF, etc. But what I find so nice about being in Malaysia is that access is quite ready. I mean, you can access the policymakers. The fact that I'm sitting with you, Kari, you as former health minister, Cheryl.
We're nobody. I hope you have access to the ministers.
But that's we do have access to ministers, and I think that's just something that goes underappreciated in many ways. So access is really not an issue, but of course, access is just the starting point. You also have to demonstrate value in terms of what you do, what you say, how you present things, which leads me to your second question. The political economy of any country is different in many ways, and in some ways, and I'll say this sort of a mea culpa. The World Bank has this reputation of, we come in with sort of first best solutions, and that's the perception at least. And again, in my years of working in different country contexts in 4 different continents, it's you really have to appreciate the political economy. The world at best is second best. Okay, so instead of always pushing for the theoretically first best option, you do have to take into account the political. And I'll explain, if you have time, I'll give you a concrete example. Take subsidy reform in Malaysia, right? So one approach is, well, subsidies are a drain for the fiscal purse, and so therefore we need to rationalize them. That is true, but it's much more complicated than that. The fact that in the case of Malaysia, subsidies are 3% of GDP, almost, more than double of what Singapore or Thailand spends. So they've been there for a while, and subsidies have become sort of pervasive in Malaysia. You could almost argue that it's seeped into the psyche of the Malaysians. and which I understand. So instead of saying, well, that doesn't matter and we have to sort of address the subsidy issue, if you're a person, I mean, half of Malaysians earn less than 2,400, 2,500 ringgit, barely above the minimum wage of 1,500. So if you're a person in that half, you ask yourself, has the government done everything else before they start taking my subsidies away? That's a political economy issue. And politicians then respond to they want to get re-elected. So you see how it becomes so difficult. So I think a better appreciation of those sorts of issues, which is why it's so valuable to be in the field and to talk to people from all across the spectrum. So that's the way we inform our policy advice. And one final thing on subsidy, I know you have a question, Kerry. One final thing on subsidy reform is that, again, so if you look at it, what is the subsidy for? And there are typically two reasons. One is for equity reasons, one is for efficiency reasons. And I think we've gone, and that is not explained properly, if I can say so, by many policymakers, and they sometimes confuse the two, right? So if you look at equity, if you look at fuel subsidies, we all know that the bulk of the benefits goes to the top T20 as known in Malaysia, right? And so the World Bank then does these fancy simulations and say, well, if you took the subsidy away, and it would reduce poverty by X%, all right? But this is the political economy that I think we also need to continually work on. If you rationalize subsidies, it's good for the poor, okay? No doubt. And the rich can get by. But it's the middle class that gets hurt arguably the most from these subsidies. So understanding the political economy of the middle class, what is it that they want? Because they would have the subsidy mostly removed from them. And do they want part of these subsidies to be to go for the global good? For example, for EVs and for public charging infrastructure to address global warming. Is it mostly for the regional good? To help for the national good? Should Malaysia use some of these subsidy savings and pay down national debt? Is it for the local good towards public transportation? Or is it for poverty reduction? Would the middle class be okay in taking all these subsidy savings and channeling to the poor? So we don't have answers. I don't think anybody in Malaysia, it's not just us, anybody in Malaysia has answers to these questions as of now. So again, better understanding the political economy, in particular the middle class in Malaysia, is really important.
Apurva, just before we get into the discussion on Malaysia, I just wanted to talk about our interaction with the World Bank. Maybe Kian, your experience as Deputy Minister. I can confirm what you said, in a sense that the World Bank, at least in Malaysia, is very advisory, since we don't take loans from you. And I've never been imposed anything from the World Bank when I was in cabinet or when I was in government. But the question I wanted to ask you was, what happens with countries who take loans from you? And for the benefit of listeners, typically countries from the global south, less developed countries, they will take loans from the World Bank for development projects. Malaysia did many years ago. The International Bank for Reconstruction, I think, initially gave Malaysia some loans for infrastructure way back when, just after independence. But in those cases, I'm just interested, in those cases, do you have conditions attached to those loans?
So we have a whole, sort of process in place, the way loans are done. And if I hark back to my experience in working in Kenya and all, right? So there is a process. We jointly identify what the gap is, where the gap is, whether it's in infrastructure, whether it's in schools, hospitals, social infrastructure, and then we give loans. And most of these are subsidized loans, at least in the context of Africa, etc. And that's the way it works. Sometimes there are conditions, sometimes there are not. So, some of the conditions are, for example, okay, if you take money from the World Bank, then you better have a proper procurement system in place. Because as we know, most of the leakages happen in infrastructure during procurement, right? So you adopt some of the best practices that we have formed over the last 60, 70 years. And so if you call that a condition, okay, call it a condition, but I think it's a healthy, good condition to have. Or you won't destroy the environment when you take a loan from the World Bank and build something, right? So those are good conditions, one can argue. I was about to say something else, but I lost my train of thought.
I'll just add on a bit to that. I think one of the value propositions that the World Bank brings to countries like Malaysia and other developing countries would be the comparisons that they can make with other countries. We may not be aware of what's happening in Kenya, in Russia, or other places where you have inputs and experience in. But if, let's say, we want to know about what you're doing with regards to SME digitalization, you have contacts in other places that we don't have access to. My personal experience as Deputy Minister of MITI was an exercise that the World Bank took in terms of making certain propositions and proposals on the investment promotion agencies, MIDA and some of the regional corridors. And we can see now the Prime Minister is putting that into place by having some sort of process of some level of consolidation among the IPAs.
Great. Cheryl, you want to jump in?
I wanted to start our conversation about Malaysia and Malaysia's economic situation, Apurva, with this question of productivity. You mentioned the question of wages has to increase before subsidy rationalization happens. I think all of us have attendant concerns around that. Maybe begin with productivity, because one of my favorite reports over the last few years that World Bank produced was around productivity, and I think other people also kind of wrote around that report a few years ago. And if I remember correctly, the World Bank said Malaysia's productivity growth is okay, but lagging behind some comparables. What do you think is needed in the next few years within this term of government, this administration, that will appreciably increase this productivity rate growth?
So you're spot on, Cheryl. So productivity growth in Malaysia is not stellar, and it has nothing to do with this government or previous government. It's just a trend, long-term trend that we see in Malaysia of declining productivity growth. Now, it depends on what sort of lens you put through it. If you take a long-term perspective, one of the reasons why productivity has been declining is investments. So if you look at where, say, investments as a share of GDP were pre-Asian financial crisis, they were 42-43% of GDP. That's pretty high. And what's happened over the decades is that the share of investment to GDP has steadily and persistently come down. Now it's below 20%. It's about 19-odd%. Right? So if you don't have investments, and especially the right quality investments, how are you going to increase your productivity?
This was both private and public investment, right?
Yes, so total investment. Yeah, so that's one. The other is on the supply side, if you will. If you look at the education system, you have to ask yourself, is the education system delivering in terms of what's required to be a productive citizen in a globalized 21st century? And you can look at the standardized PISA scores, and again, Malaysia lags in several ways. In fact, going back to what Kian Ming, you said, one of the comparative advantages that we are able to do this benchmarking. Just last month, we launched a regional study on education, and on schooling rather, and where we found that the learning poverty in Malaysia is 40%.
What is the learning poverty?
Yeah, so this means that 4 out of 10 Malaysian kids under 10 years old cannot read a sentence, or they cannot fully interpret what the sentence says. That is much higher than most other countries in the region, right? So you have to ask yourself, so going back to the productivity issue, so if you don't get your schooling right, especially at a early, from the primary, and I would argue even preschooling stage, you're not going to get much. And talking of preschooling, let me give you another example. So it really surprised me when I first came to Malaysia 2 years back, and I had to make sure that I had my facts right. If you look at nutrition in this country, in an almost high-income country, so we found that about 22% of children under 5 years old suffer from stunting. 14% of children are obese. Right? Are not obese, they're underweight. It's the opposite, they're underweight, right? And most of this is felt by, surprise, the poor, vulnerable communities. So think of your rural, poor Saravakian kid, right? So one way of addressing this is to do through the schooling program. And if you talk of preschooling, now Malaysia has a pretty good, I think it's called Susu Sekolah, the milk feeding program. And so it's a simple thing of taking it from primary schools and extending it, advancing it to pre-school levels. Now that's an easy fix, that's an easy policy fix. And people shouldn't argue against it. So doing things like that can make a huge difference, because some of the biggest inequalities we see happen at birth. So just to wrap up on the productivity front, so getting your schooling right at the very early stage, and then through the years to have the right kind of skills. And what are the skills that people are desiring here? It's digital skills, where Malaysia lags. It's soft skills. So many Malaysians have many degrees, but are the degrees worth it? How do you get the soft skills of collaboration, of communication, of working together, etc.? So these are the things that would all help boost productivity. And the third and final thing I would say in terms of boosting productivity is make your economy more competitive. The fact that Malaysia still has a system of APs, approved permits, which are basically monopolies. If you think of rice, if you think of food security, so rice still has a monopoly. So people who provide rice still have a monopoly over providing it.
In terms of imports.
In terms of imports, yeah. So and give you throw out another factoid. So exposed to GDP some 15, 20 years ago, 2000 I think, were about 120% of GDP. Now they've declined to less than 70%, 68%, right? So why are you exposed to decline? Why aren't you more competitive? Because you're not liberalizing in some ways enough, right? So you're not making your economy competitive in segments where it can be. So these three things put together, so declining investments and upping them, addressing this issue of schooling right from preschool through the life cycle to building digital skills and soft skills and so on and so forth. And then third, which is on making your economy more competitive. So I think these are it's not magic, it's not a magic pill, it's not anything new for people like us to analyze the economy, but these are the three principal things that would help improve productivity growth.
When I was working at the Ministry of Health, I chaired the committee on double malnutrition. So you mentioned one half of it, which is stunting. And actually, it was either UNICEF or World Bank study, could have been UNICEF, which showed stunting to be prevalent not just in the rural communities, which you mentioned, but also in the urban areas. And there was a study on low-cost flats. Nutrition security is certainly deficient in some families. I said the double burden of malnutrition because amongst some children, it's the other side of the spectrum, which is obesity. So one of the things that I suggested, which Treasury didn't take up, was to extend that assistance that you mentioned. You said preschool. I said, no, bring it all the way up to the first 1,000 days. That's when the mother gets pregnant, right up to the first couple of years of the baby's life. So it was a simple universal scheme where I proposed to the Ministry of Finance that we give mothers cash transfer assistance for the first 1,000 days. It's been done in many other countries. And the thinking, of course, is that at that point of a woman's life, they would be very, very predisposed to spend it correctly on the nutrition and the early development of the child. But these are the sort of thinkings, these are the sort of ideas and thinking that we can discuss later when we talk about social protection. Coming to your point about investments, the new industrial master plan, which Kianmen worked on, has this phrase to try to bring in more investments which increase Malaysia's economic complexity, which suggests that we want investments which don't treat Malaysia as the global factory, as a factory of the world, but rather more the R&D hub of the world, or at least where we create more value. So it's not just testing and assembly for chips, computer chips, but rather it's the integrated circuit design, it's the wafer fabrication part of it, if you just look at that particular product. Is that the right approach? I mean, do we just throw around words like economic complexity and hope that it's going to come in and that productivity goes up with the supply side measures that you mentioned just now?
Yeah, so obviously just throwing around words doesn't change things. You have to follow words with concrete actions and policies and regulations, etc. Now, in the spirit of transparency, the World Bank has also been somewhat involved with the NIMP, and we've worked with with people like Dr. Kian Ming and others on providing advice. So but your question, is the approach right? I think the approach is absolutely correct. Malaysia cannot be the factory of the world forever, even when it comes to semiconductors. And I'm going to share some thoughts on semiconductors. So you need to make products that are more complex. And if you look at the history of development, keeping in mind that development is a game of snake and ladder, so there's no absolute truth to it. Countries that make more complex products and complex services are the ones that develop more. Now, the causation also runs the other way. So countries that develop more make more complex products and services. So it's a bit of both, but I think the approach is definitely the right one. Now, on the NIMP, I think it's a good plan, good document. Just the fact that it's compared to the previous industrial master plan, it's less sector focused per se, and it's more focused on horizontal interventions versus vertical ones. So all that is good. My one, if you will, critiques of the NIMP is that it doesn't talk enough about liberalization of services. So even though ostensibly it's a national industrial master plan, services are an input to manufacturing. And in the case of Malaysia, and what do I mean by services? The services like legal services, accounting services, et cetera, and even schooling is a service, by the way, right? So these services are quite trade restrictive in the case of Malaysia. In fact, the OECD World Bank has this thing called the Service Trade Restrictiveness Index, and Malaysia is the 8th most restrictive country out of 50 that we study, Japan being the least in the region, right? So services are not liberalized enough. So that is my one sort of small critique, and I would love to hear Kian Ming's take on that, if it will. But before I do that, so Khairi, if you don't mind, going back to what you said when you were minister, you had proposed this scheme, and it goes back to what Charles said about political economy as well. To me, it seemed like a no-brainer, but it did not happen. So I'm curious, from your experience, why did that not happen?
The standard answer that we always get from Treasury, of course, is fiscal constraints. Money. So it's really about how you prioritize your spending. I feel that the House view of Treasury sometimes make it very difficult for us to argue for universal assistance, which I think has been proven in many countries. And that leads to Treasury always insisting, if they relent, on means-tested approaches. And means-tested approaches are fine, but it does create errors of inclusion, errors of exclusion, which I think have learned a lot from. And if you study the effectiveness of BRIM, yes, it's been popular, but whether it's reached the actual target group that it was intended to, that some empirical studies have come up to show that perhaps not. So that's why my thinking of late has moved more towards a universalistic approach. But again, you come across this prevailing groupthink within Treasury that, let's just, why are we giving it to everyone? This doesn't make sense. It has to be means tested. Sorry, we don't have the fiscal space to do so. It comes back to prioritization of what we spend the money on in government. Kian Ming, your experience? You were in Treasury before you were at MITI.
Yes, I think you're right in terms of that kind of groupthink. But I think a way to adjust that would be, two fronts. I know we are not talking about the subsidy rationalization program yet, but I think if, let's say, to convince Treasury that the money is there, then some other programs such as the petrol subsidy, the retargeting of the petrol subsidy could be one way in which some allocation or additional allocation can be found for those programs. And then for those specific programs, rather than to say that it's universal to let's say all schools, for example, or all preschools, you could say only public schools, private schools are not included. And then for the mothers, there may be certain mechanisms whereby you want to say that, look, the implementation or the delivery of those that milk products would be in areas whereby it's very likely that only those who really need it will get it. it can be universal, but the uptake of it would be more naturally targeted towards the people who need it. On the advanced economic complexity part, I think it's an important component of the NIMP, one of the 4 missions. And I think we are in a sweet spot right now in terms of implementation and also funding, in the sense that you talked about design of integrated circuit chips. This is one area where we can see a lot more interest in moving that kind of activity out from, let's say, places like China or even Taiwan. And Malaysia is a beneficiary, or can be a beneficiary, if we get our investment ecosystem right, together with the right skills. Because I know, for example, the Koreans are interested to come to Malaysia, especially in the memory front, which is where they are very strong in. So it's a matter of getting the policies right to put that proper implementation in place.
So on that, I just remember that I said, I'll say something on semiconductors, and that's the semiconductor industry in Malaysia is a great example of the potential Malaysia has to move up the economic complexity ladder, right? So, and if you look at, because of the geopolitics, realpolitik, whatever you might want to call it, Malaysia's semiconductor industry right now is in a good place. It's exporting more to the US, it's exporting more to China, both, right? And semiconductors are now about 22% of all exports by value. I mean, that is huge. Malaysia's share of the global IC integrated circuit globally is about 8%. Again, that's huge for a country like Malaysia. But, and there's always a but, if you look at Malaysia's share of most advanced patents and semiconductors, it's 0.07%.
Sure.
You know, so it's minuscule. If you look at the patents that are filed in the Malaysia Patent Office, 80% of them are foreign owned. If you look at R&D in Malaysia, it's just about 1% of GDP. Half of China is 1/3 of Taiwan's. Right? So I really want to emphasize what Kian Ming said. So you have to combine that with skills upgrading or upskilling or whatever phrase you might want to use. Otherwise, you're going to miss this window of opportunity. And I also want to emphasize this window of opportunity is shrinking. And even, so somebody asked me this question, Kyrie, at some conference, why can't Malaysia just continue specializing at the low end of the semiconductor value chain? After all, somebody needs to do it, and we have an advantage in that. And it was a good question, and it made me think, and the answer to that is that a country like India now has entered the low end of the semiconductor value chain big time. In India, the situation is reversed. So India always had an advantage in design and development, not in assembly and testing, but we all want to now become chip independent, so to speak. And India has entered that segment in a big way. Closer to home, you have Vietnam nipping away at that advantage. So this window is limited and it's shrinking.
Just to wrap this up, on chips still. So we all sort of agree more or less that this trajectory is right. Economic complexity, you want to move away from the lower value end of testing and assembly to design, to the wafer fabs. What is the role of government? Because if you look at TSMC, for instance, Taiwan, that was a government initiative. It still is a government initiative. And the Taiwan government put in a lot of money to set that up. Does Malaysia even have the fiscal ability to do this? And if it doesn't, can the private sector create this market? Let's be honest here.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think Malaysia is not where TSMC was, decades ago. So we already have a base of a decent. You have a decent semiconductor base in Malaysia already, mostly in Penang, right? So what is the role of government in all of this? Let me go back to my point on investments, how they've been declining. Now, the World Bank does investor surveys in practically every country we work, and we've been doing that for the last, 50, 60 odd years. And what surprises me most is that how consistent the top 3 reasons for why investors invest in any country, be it in semiconductors, be it in manufacturing, anything, have always remained the same. The first is policy stability, not even political stability, but policy stability, because politicians can come and go. But if your policy framework is stable, that's number 1. Number 2 is the quality of your infrastructure. It used to be physical infrastructure, now it's increasingly digital. And Malaysia, you can argue, does reasonably okay on these 2, but it's the third where it falls short, and which is what the role of government is, be it semiconductors or be it anything else. It's talent, talent, talent. And the way Malaysia tries to address the talent shortage is by providing tax incentives, which again drain the fiscal purse. These are not World Bank numbers, but BNM of years ago calculated that Malaysia loses about 8 to 9% of revenues because of tax incentives. And I have nothing against tax incentives, but you have to separate out the good from the bad and the ugly. So this is the role of government, to focus on skills and talent.
Want to try and make this discussion a bit spicier so it's not so dry. A segue to that is something people always say, Malaysians always say about ourselves, is that we are great in doing plans, and NIMP, Madani, all sound good on paper. What is the World Bank's view, and your personal view, about the NIMP targets? Let's begin there, and then maybe we can dovetail into Madani as well. For example, there's this great big leap that we want to get, median manufacturing wages from under 2,000 ringgit a month to 4,510 in 8 years. That sounds huge to me, 10% CAGR. Based on your observations and reading NIMP and being involved in it, is that even realistic?
So anything is realistic if you can devote the resources and efforts to it, right? So in the spirit of making it sort of less less dry and less econ speak, let me ask you guys a question. It's a trick question, so don't think too hard, all right? There are 3 birds sitting on a branch. 2 of them decide to fly away. How many are left?
One.
1, right? The answer is 3. Because there's a difference between deciding and doing, okay? And this is the problem I see with Malaysia. Malaysia has too many plans and policies. Malaysia doesn't, we know what needs to be done in this country. And it's really the doing part, the implementation part that really needs to be focused on. And then if I scratch under the surface, and I did a tweet on this, on the fragmentation. So it's shocking to me, you're talking of social assistance type of issues earlier. There are about 16, 17 agencies that administer over around 170 social assistance programs. There are 70 agencies that provide some sort of skills training programs in Malaysia. There are 35 agencies at the central and local levels that provide some sort of SME support programs, right? So this is proliferation and fragmentation of that hinders implementation. Do
we have too many programs, too many departments?
It is definitely fragmented, but there's a silver lining, and I'm curious, Khairi, I wanted to ask you this question. So, if I think of it, you can just throw your hands up and say, "Oh well, it's pointless trying to do anything about it." But during COVID times, and this happened before I came here, I understand that there were at some point over 180 plus SOPs when COVID struck, and every single place had their own SOP. But Malaysia, I don't know if you had a hand in it, probably you did, ultimately consolidated that into one SOP and to My Sejahtera. So it can be done. So why can't that same sort of level of focus and intensity be applied to this sort of fragmentation that we see all around us?
Political will.
And then I'll come to the Madani question.
Political will in to give it its actual obstacle. So when you talk about the SOPs, yes, there were tens, 180 SOPs. The quartet that was chaired by Datuk Seri Syamuddin was one of the 4 ministers in the quartet. We reduced it to just 1. I think COVID SOP is slightly different from the proliferation of government departments. I think that's because we didn't know what we were dealing with, the concern of dealing with a virus, unprecedented, all of that. But I think the thinking, of course, is correct. How do we streamline things? Before I went to the Ministry of Health, I was at the Ministry of Science, Technology and Innovation. And apart from being the custodian of the nation's R&D, it was also, to me, a storeroom for agencies where you couldn't place them anywhere else. So, for instance, all the tech agencies were under MOSTI, Cradle, MDV, MavCap,
TPM.
TPM, less of a tech agency, more of a
What is
facilities
what is
management.
TPM?
Technology Park Malaysia,
okay.
Magic, which I consolidated
Magic
into
and Ranti and all that.
Meranti,
Yeah,
Kumpulan Modal Perdana, Might. So we had too many. And when I looked at the history of these agencies, they were created for many, many different reasons, some political and some with very, very specific mandates, which end up having mission creep. They ended up, taking up more things. And at the end of the day, Treasury has to give money to most of these agencies. I think only one or two maybe were self-sustaining. The rest had to ask money for DE. Some had to ask money for OE to pay staff. And had I had another year or two there, I would have consolidated even more. I merged TPM with Magic, for instance, to become Ranti. That was the start of trying to streamline things. So I think we have the fragmentation that you speak of earlier has unfortunately been a product of politics. It's been a product of inertia as well. Once, I think when you were at the Treasury, Kan Meng, you spoke of zero-based budgeting. Every single department had to justify every year why they needed to exist. It was an existential question. But let's be honest, it never happened. So now it's just filling up the line item again. What did you get last year? 10 million. Okay, this year you get 15 million because we're doing well. Oh, this year we get 5 million because we're consolidating or fiscal consolidation. It's back to that.
Yeah.
So,
Or you put MavCap and Penjana under Khazanah and then no money already.
or you do that, but that's gonna put pressure on Khazanah. Khazanah is gonna come back and say, dividends this year may be an issue because we've had to give DE for stuff that you've lumped onto us.
Yeah, to answer the political economy question a little bit further, no minister, or very few ministers will be like Harry, whereby they want to reduce the number of agencies because it will also reduce the number of jobs that you can give out and
eventually,
budget and things like that. In a situation where my party DAPs and in any part of the government, any consolidation could be used to attack the government to say that you were reducing the number of civil service jobs. In the case sometimes even contract jobs. So it's sensitive, but there are cases where government agencies have been closed down or have been sort of like cold storage and not been given budget. Agency Inovasi Malaysia, that was closed down under Pakatan Harapan subsequently. And then Pemandu, this was something that was closed down and then re-emerged in another private capacity, but it was closed down and then the budget was taken away.
Spat,
yes. Put under the Ministry of Transport.
So one thing that we've discovered in our work is that because of this excessive fragmentation, people don't know where to go to seek assistance, and it perpetuates
100%.
inequalities in
100%.
ways that you might not imagine.
Yeah.
So if you think of the SME support program,
Sure.
guess who's benefiting most from it? It's not really the SMEs, it's more of the larger SMEs or the larger firms, right? So it perpetuates inequality. And just the sheer, if I think of the rakyat, right? For average citizen going down to get a form or something, the sheer sort of despair and humility you have to go through to jump through all these hoops to get something.
So in the tech funding
much.
ecosystem, when I was at Mosti, there was this pejorative term called grantpreneurs. So you have professional entrepreneurs who chase after the grants, who discovered that they'd be the multiple recipients because they knew which door to knock on. We got to take a break quickly because we're gonna just reset and we're gonna come back because Apurva hasn't answered whether he's impressed with the Madani narrative.
Okay.
Selamat kembali ke episod terkini Keluar Sekejap bersama Dr. Ong Kian Ming dan juga Dr. Apurva Sanghi daripada Bank Dunia. Apurva, before the break, we were talking and I threw you a question around your impressions about the Madani economic narrative and whether it was the right narrative. Maybe let me add on another question to that. Do you think it's achievable? Not just does it sound good, but will it work?
Right. So the way I interpret the Madani framework is that it's saying something quite straightforward and intuitive. It's saying that development is not just about raising average incomes. Everybody needs to benefit from growth and development. It needs to be inclusive and it needs to be done in a sustainable manner, right? And there are things that go beyond just raising growth rates or so on and so forth. So you have to take into account cultural, social, historical factors into development. And I totally agree with that. It's development, again, it's not just about GDP growth rates, so on and so forth. And a good manifestation of that, if you look at the 2024, the budget, is increase in sort of social cash assistance. Now, it might not be enough, and you can argue around all that, but it's a good manifestation of how a Madani principle is actually being implemented on the ground. Now, so I like the narrative, and I have to say I equally like the Keluar Malaysia narrative from the previous administration. It's about making families and households strong. So I think people have their narratives, and this was a good one. The issue, not with Madani per se, with narratives in general, is that at the end of the day, as I said, it's about doing, it's about implementing, right? And in the case of Malaysia, the reforms have to be at an economy-wide level, because the structural problems are not going to go away with this narrative or that. So what are the structural problems? Things such as over-reliance on commodity revenues, fiscally speaking, the issue of skills that we touched upon, lack of nutrition for most kids in Malaysia. Right, so these things have to be resolved on an economy-wide level, and we touched upon it earlier, making the economy more competitive in certain areas and bringing in more investment and so on and so forth. So this is where I think Malaysia needs to focus on. So solving these structural constraints.
So Apurva, you talked about doing, and I think all of us were involved in this kind of policy debate in one way or another, which is the over-reliance of Malaysia on foreign workers, which has an impact on wages, which also drags down investment, both private, especially on the private side, in terms of investing in more machines and things of that nature. And we've also kicked the can down the road on the implementation of something called the multi-tiered levy for foreign workers. So what is your view in terms of this kind of challenge that Malaysia faces, and any things that we can do in terms of overcoming this challenge?
And Apurva, just before you answer, I just want to give you some, at least my experience sitting in cabinet about foreign workers. And I remember a previous Prime Minister, I think it was Pak many years ago, said that we were addicted to a few things, and one was foreign workers. And I saw that when I was in cabinet, because there's always been this statement of intent from successive prime ministers and governments saying that we want to reduce foreign workers. The moment the economy slows down, the moment, well, it was COVID as well, or the moment economy slows down, the moment there are global headwinds, the representations will come from manufacturing, will come from the furniture industry, will come from different sectors saying, can we have 1,000? Can we have 6,000? That becomes 10,000. That becomes, and then restaurants and mission creep again, where every single sector is asking for foreign workers, and everyone's like, okay, we'll get on the foreign worker gravy train again. So this is a classic case where statement of intent and implementation, there's a huge gulf, because it's so easy to say, let's approve another 50,000 from Bangladesh, from Nepal, from Vietnam, or wherever it is.
Right. So I have to say that we haven't done any analysis on the issue of foreign workers in Malaysia. So I'm going to share with you my emerging thoughts, subject to change. Sure. And I've heard this issue a lot, that foreign workers are in many ways a bane in Malaysia, and we are addicted to foreign workers, etc. And I just wonder, to what extent is that really true? Now, if you look at most of the jobs that foreign workers do, they are what you guys call the 3D jobs, right? So, and COVID offered a natural experiment in many ways. So when you had all the constraints in terms of incoming foreign labor, etc., when the economy started opening up, how many firms, Malaysian firms and Malaysian workers actually ran in to fill in those jobs or automated to become more productive? Not many, right? So I think it's easy to point one's fingers at foreign workers as a root of all malaise. Malaise as in, you know what I mean, right? So And I forget where I read this, in either the Star or the Edge. The latest is where foreign workers were being blamed for the ringgit depreciation.
Because we repatriate a lot.
Remittance,
Yeah, and if you look at the trends as a percentage of GDP,
it's
actually
tiny.
repatriation had actually gone down by foreign workers when the ringgit had depreciated the most. So I don't necessarily buy into the notion that foreign workers are the problem per se. The issue again goes back to the lack of competitiveness in the Malaysian economy. The fact that the Malaysian economy tends to be dominated by a few large firms. And let me share one statistic with you. About 3% of large firms generate over 60% of output and employ over half of all employees. Right? So if it's so top heavy, where is the competition? GLCs are classified as private enterprise in Malaysia, which sort of surprises me to the day. So the issue is when you talk about foreign workers as a cause for Malaysia not moving up the productivity ladder, are foreign workers really the issue, or is the fact that there's really not enough competition among Malaysian companies, among Malaysian GLCs? There's not enough private enterprise that firms tend to not compete and therefore not move up the productivity ladder.
So my personal view, guys, is maybe foreign workers is the prevalence of it is more a symptom as opposed to a cause, right?
And they're more visible too, right? So it's very easy to...
And it plays into certain, not so pleasant xenophobic tropes
But
sometimes.
I'm very glad to hear
But
that.
Kemeng, you were at MITI. Coming back, yes, it is a symptom to some extent. But what was this, the almost laziness of companies after all the incentives we've given for automation, for trying to make sure that the capital investment increases, but still they will come back and say, I need foreign workers.
It's an easy way out because, like you just said, the manufacturers and others would know. Once you put pressure on the government would
Cave.
And I've seen this, when I've attended meetings whereby they said, okay, government said we're going to introduce the multi-tier levy. The business...
Can you explain a bit?
The multi-tier levy basically says that if you employ X percentage of foreign workers...
Kalau banyak, you have to pay more lah.
Yes, correct. Yeah. So if over 75% of your workforce is foreign workers, you have to pay more in terms of the additional
Disincentive.
levy. Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
So they said, yeah, fine, we agree on it. But implement it next year. So in the meantime, then the next year will become the next year and next year and next year. And then it suddenly becomes perpetuity. But I would push back on what Apurva said a little bit, in terms of talking about the competitiveness area. I would say that many of our companies are also, not being fair to our own workers, in the sense that rather than to pay, let's say, 2,000, 2,005 above the minimum wage, or even to pay overtime for our local workers, they would say, look, this will increase our cost base by too much because we're paying too much to our own people. And they said, okay, you can't fill that role, just give it to the foreign workers. And the irony is that you actually end up spending more because you're talking about additional levies, you're talking about needing additional housing for the foreign workers and whatnot. So I've seen this in action by some companies. I won't name them. And my friend, our good friend Liu Chin Tong, he's said publicly, if you are willing to pay a certain percentage of the salary that what Singapore offers in ringgit terms, I think many of the workers Malaysian workers who are doing some of these 3D jobs in Singapore may consider coming back. So just a little bit of pushback on that.
So I would love to push back against your pushback. Sure. So if you look at wages in Malaysia, and that's a very important issue, we all sort of know that wages are low in Malaysia, and that's a common refrain. But you have to ask, low compared to what? Compared to whom? They are definitely low compared to Singapore, for example. If you look at wage growth in Malaysia is actually lower than in many ASEAN countries. If you look at Cambodia, Thailand, Vietnam, still above Philippines and at par with Indonesia. So using these regional benchmarks, wage growth has been low. So wage growth in Malaysia over the last 10, 12 years has been about 12% or so, something like that, right? But then you have to benchmark wage growth with productivity growth. Okay, and it goes back to the very interesting question Sharil asked me, and I apologize if it's getting economies. But interestingly, if you look at the data in Malaysia, and again, we like to be informed by data evidence analysis, wage growth has been above productivity growth in Malaysia, and universally across all sectors based on the latest data we have. And this is a really important point that does not get discussed enough. So Malaysian workers may be lowly paid compared to other countries, but they're not being underpaid compared to their productivity within Malaysia. So wages are low because productivity is low. That's a really important point. It goes back to how do you increase productivity.
So what is your view on, and we don't know the details yet because this white paper has not been tabled in Parliament yet, but the Minister for Economy, Rafizi, has announced this progressive wage model, which presumably is some progressive intervention by the government, similar, if not exactly the same, to a tripartite model that Singapore does, where you sort of sit down with the unions and you sit down with the employers and you sort of decide some sort of median wage according to sectors, according to job functions and things like that. But if productivity is not kept up with wage growth, then what are we talking about here?
Yeah, that's a great question. And again, based on the facts and figures, wage growth is above productivity growth in every sector that we have seen. So by forcing wages to go up without commensurate increases in productivity, you're not going to get much. You're not going to get anywhere. That is my view, right? It's just basic Econ 101. You have to have productivity growth commensurate with wage growth. Otherwise, it's just a recipe for more inflation. Now, let me give you a concrete example for your viewers. Now, Singapore is cited by many as a good example of the progressive wage model, if you will. Now, if you look at what happened in the early 80s in Singapore, so Singapore had the National Wage Council in the early 80s recommended, again, I forget the numbers, some 11-12% increase in wages, which was adopted. Soon after which, Singapore went through its first post-independence recession. Now, there are many factors, external, domestic, but one internal factor contributing to the recession was this sort of almost forced increase in wages. And in the context of productivity growth not keeping pace. And then the Economic Advisory Council in Singapore had to backtrack. They had to say, okay, we need to move towards, we cannot go down this path anymore. We need to make wages more flexible, more market-driven. So people forget about this episode in Singapore's history, the first recession ever in Singapore's history, right? So it's regarding the specifics of the PWM, the progressive wage model, let's see what it says. But from what I understand, it is now not mandatory. It's a voluntary opt-in, which is fine. And by voluntary opt-in, from what I understand, is that a firm sign up for
they get some incentives.
They get some incentives, but then the question is at what cost?
Exactly.
Right? So we don't know. Let's wait for the details. But I do agree with YB Rafizi and Mr. Rafizi in one thing, that there needs to be a clear exit policy for whoever signs up for this, and that I think is sensible. And finally, on the progressive wage model, I would say that if you look at experience around you, if you are going to go down that road, Australia is a good example of a relatively successful progressive wage type model. And the keys to its success was to make the wage increases very clear, make them gradual, so small increments, gradual, and very transparent. Right? So these are, so if you're going to go down that road, I mean, there are some examples out there.
Yeah, just one last thing that I'll say about this, which is, you brought up the Singapore example. Their progressive wage model is actually limited to only 3 or 4 professions.
Right.
Yeah.
Mostly at the lower end.
That's the
and
anchor, no?
On the Singapore side as well.
But Sharal's point is that it's an anchor, and it in theory it's supposed to put this pressure on other sectors as well.
But I think the more important thing that Singapore did was to signal to private industry that they would have a tightening of the foreign labor requirements and also quota. They still do have that, but then it's going to get more and more expensive over time. They stuck to that policy, and because of that, a lot of those kind of more labor-intensive industries actually shifted to other places, China, some to Malaysia, and then more capital investment came into play, and then you had higher wages. So it was, it was a virtuous cycle, and I hope that Malaysia can go towards that direction.
Just a quick pushback, Apurva, and I think we'd be remiss if we didn't question this narrative that always employers say we can't raise wages because productivity is not growing so fast. So I think maybe just discuss a bit more about that, because the Madani narrative framework, Madani framework has one goal: to increase the portion of
Salary
to
to
GDP. So I think 40-odd%, 45%. So that suggests it is lower than it should be, or it's lower than what we want to achieve as a developed economy. How does one, as an economist, explain those two things? Having low productivity or wages increasing faster than productivity, but at the same time, the portion of the national income that goes to wages is still lower. Meaning, suggesting that shareholders, capitalists,
Capital owners.
got money.
So a great question. You guys are really asking me easy questions here, I see. So listen, so let me reiterate, wages are low in Malaysia because productivity is low. Okay, if you want to increase wages, you increase productivity, and we spoke about some measures. Then this compensation share of labor versus capital, as an economist, I have to say I scratch my head and wonder about it. If it's a goal in and of itself,
Or a symptom.
or a symptom. So the correct way of assessing well-being is income per capita, real income per capita, if you want to be technical. It's not the share of income going to labor. And the share of income going to labor, the problems I have with that notion is that, first of all, it's as if you're taking from capital and giving to labor. It's redistributive. And remember, we spoke about how capital investments have been declining. So if anything, Malaysia needs more investments, right? So there's a dichotomy in that notion or that narrative first. The second is that it really depends on the structure of the economy. So if you look at just oil and gas in Malaysia, that is highly capital intensive. The labor share is, I think, in the 20s, right? But the median wage or even the mean wage in the oil and gas sector is much higher than in other sectors. So we're really barking up the wrong tree when we want to say, let's increase this 30% to 40+%. Again, the real issue is you want to improve well-being, you want to improve incomes per capita, and it's all about productivity growth.
That was my way of making you criticize or critique the Madani narrative.
No, I'm just speaking as an economist. It's not
Sure.
about critiquing this or that.
Let's go back to basics now and talk the language of the man on the street, the person on the street rather. Rashid Ghaffur, the governor of the central bank, made a statement a couple of days ago about the third quarter, expanded 3.3%, headline inflation moderated to 2%. Top line, things look pretty good. Of course, it's moderated from last year. High base effect. Last year was a exceptional rebound. Thanks to the opening up after COVID, the pandemic. But coming back to this issue of the disconnect between the headline numbers and what people are feeling on the street, how does an economist explain this? Because I couldn't explain it as a politician. Why are the headline numbers for GDP so good? The IPP numbers good. Everything seems to be trending north, but I go to the pasar, I go to the supermarket, I go to the market to spend, and my ringgit is not going as far as it used to.
Right. Okay, so first of all, let me say that what Governor Rashid has said is, of course, all correct and all true, and I second all the headline numbers. But there is a disconnect, I think, between these headline numbers and how the rakyat feels on the ground. And top of my head, I can think of three reasons, and let me elaborate on each of these. So it's the emphasis on growth, then looking at inflation and jobs. These are things that really matter to any one of us, right? So let's talk about growth. So when we say growth was X last year and is Y this year, of course growth is important, no denying that. But again, you cannot eat growth. So growth is felt differently by different people. And the way most people feel it is through per capita sort of income. How much are the incomes increasing? You could have blockbuster growth, but if it's being captured by a few, it doesn't affect most of us, right? So and if you look at real capita per incomes, they have been increasing in Malaysia, which is a good thing, but still, and they're above pre-COVID levels. But if you think of a world where before COVID, real capita per incomes were going, current real capita per incomes are still below that. And it's a mental thing. Most of us want to feel whole in some ways. We want to go back to our lives before COVID. And that is a mental model I think, my hunch is most of us have. And so even real per capita incomes haven't caught up to that, right? So that's one. So this emphasis on growth versus what really matters, standards of living, I think we need to be more transparent about this. The second is inflation. Now, we keep hearing that the pace of inflation has come down. Spot on, absolutely, that's the case. But saying that inflation is coming down is like saying if you're bleeding, you're bleeding less.
Because it's still inflation.
Right, you're still bleeding, right? You may be bleeding less, but you're still bleeding. So what do I mean by that? The pace of inflation may be coming down, but that doesn't mean that prices are coming down. And this is something that the Rakyat, right? I mean, they're not economists and they're not supposed to understand it, but when they hear statements, inflation is coming down, they go to the grocery store and see prices are still up. So obviously they're going to feel that a disconnect right there. And to just elaborate on this a bit more, if you look at, again, the pace of inflation is about 1.9% this year, down from, but this comes on top of 3.5% last year and 2.4% the year before. So the cumulative inflation, is about 7% or so, right? So prices have risen over the last 2 years by 7%. And worst is food prices. The cumulative inflation is 12%, 11 or 12%, right? And why is this important? Because most of the B10, B40, about a quarter of their incomes goes towards food. So again, when you go to the grocery store or to the pasar and you see that rice prices are still or food prices are still high, obviously there's going to be a disconnect, right? So and then finally the third thing I mentioned was jobs. Again, you look at headline unemployment numbers, they are down to 3.3, 3.4%. Great, but scratch under the surface, there's a lot of underemployment. So Malaysia is in this unenviable position where Malaysia is, as we know, is exporting high skills and importing low skills. And if you look at, and even the skills that it has, they are being underutilized. So as economists use something called a skills-based underemployment employment figure, and that has steadily risen. It's now up to 35, 36%. So think of your Grab driver who has a graduate degree or a college degree, but driving Grab to make ends meet. So you're not fully utilizing the skills. So these are the reasons why I think there's a gap between the headline numbers, which are not wrong, but they're not fully explained, and what the Rakyat feels on the ground.
Apurva, you've been in Malaysia for 2 years now.
2 glorious years.
2 glorious years,
Yes.
not yet one too many mornings, if you got that reference.
Yes, Dylan.
What are some of your more interesting observations beyond beyond the economy, just what you've seen? I hope you've fallen in love with the country.
Yeah, that's a good question. So let me share a few. So one is that in the 2 years I've been here, I've celebrated 2 Chinese New Years, 2 Deepavalis, 2 Vesaks, 4 Eids, Hari Rayas, some 2 Thayapusams. You get my drift, right? So, and if you look at it, the way I look at it is that Malaysia is an incredibly multicultural society. I mean, cultural diversity is Malaysia's strength, and not very many countries have that. Let's be honest.
Do we sell it enough, though?
So I came from Russia. Really, not that much cultural diversity. A lot of intra-country diversity, but Malaysia's strength is cultural diversity. But the question I ask myself is whether Malaysia has been able to harness this multi-ethnicity, multicultural diversity into economic strength. And I'm not sure that the answer is all that optimistic in the 2 years I have been here. But you guys are Malaysians, you tell me. But that's my first sort of passing observation. And the second I would say is that I was surprised for a country like Malaysia, which is almost at high income status, there's a lack of public intellectuals. And this is something I've shared privately with many, and they all agree.
You're looking at it, Kian-Meng and Cheryl. Kian-Meng and Cheryl.
This is as good as it
This is the
gets,
sum of public intellectuals, Kian-Meng and Cheryl. I'm just the third wheeler here. This is it.
So what do I mean by public intellectual? One category is heavy-duty academics. If you think of Paul Krugman in the US, who have broken away from the academic mold and out there engaging with the public in provocative discourse, trying to move the needle. Things I don't really see.
We have Professor K.S. Jomo, in that mold.
Yeah, Jomo, we have Farish.
You can count them in the fingers of your one hand. One person I have a lot of admiration for, whom I would classify as a public intellectual, is Andrew Sheng. But he's known much more outside of Malaysia than inside Malaysia, right?
Yep.
So that's the second thing. But let me say that Malaysians are blessed, right? So this country has so much going for it. It's not in the ring of fire like Philippines or Vietnam, for example, or Indonesia, for example. It has a reasonably domestic size sort of market, unlike neighboring Singapore. You guys bash yourself up comparing yourself to Singapore, but a lot of potential here in terms of food security and whatnot. The fact that there's a deep domestic institutional investor database, so you're not reliant on foreign borrowings as much. So there's so many strengths and so much potential, and let's not forget the food, of course. But that's a given. But can I share one thing that really struck me? So after 5 years of living in Russia, I come here, and I was amazed that each time my wife or I drew open the curtains in the morning, you guys are blessed with sunshine. Okay, and that's something that you take for granted. In the very first year, I moved to Russia, December 2016, and you can Google it, I'm not making it up, in the entire month of December, 31 days, Moscow got less than 10 minutes of sunshine. All right? So it's a very anecdotal, but just to say that Malaysia has so much going for it.
And that's renewable energy for you right there.
Renewable energy, yeah.
Apurva, sorry, just still on current issues before we try to wrap things up, and you've been very generous with the time. Another thing that people are upset about right now is the value of our currency. That comes back to how their ringgit doesn't go very far right now because the ringgit is quite weak, and of course it causes imports to be more expensive. Is there a quick fix to this, or do we just have to ride this out?
So there's no quick fix. And the reason why any currency, let alone the ringgit, moves when the currency is somewhat flexible, it's not pegged, is external factors and domestic factors. Right? And we all know that the way the US has hiked up its interest rates, that's causing a lot of grievances in many parts of the world. And in some ways, the ringgit is appreciating because of what's happening in the US, right? But let me say this on the record, that I have a lot of faith in Bank Negara. I hear criticisms privately, but each time I interact with them, going back to access to policymakers, and I think they are doing as good a job as any bank in terms of balancing the volatility and so on and so forth of the ringgit. Now, a couple of points on the ringgit. So one thing I've seen many, no naming names here, but many say that, it's because of external factors. That is true. The most of the fluctuation today is because of external factors. It's not only that. It's also domestic factors that don't get enough attention paid to. And
Such as
we spoke about the decline of investment to GDP from 40+% to 19-odd%, right? So, or the decline of exports to GDP from 120% down to 68%. So all this reduces the demand for ringgit through FDI and trade. So, you also have to look domestically. Let me give you another example. In the latest Malaysia Economic Monitor we put out, we discussed how we analyzed how the 1 MDB shock affected the value of the ringgit. And it's quite interesting. This happened during 2014, 2015, the same time as the oil price shock, right, as the oil price crisis. So the oil price, so the impact on the ringgit depreciation back then, the oil price was a lesser factor than the 1 MDB shock. So, so there are a lot of, you cannot avoid domestic reasons.
Yeah.
So, fixing your governance system. Now, of course, we have moved a long way from 1 MDB days, but still a lot of improvement to enhance, to improve governance. So, it's, what you do domestically within your borders also makes a huge difference. Yeah. And I think it's sometimes too easy to point to external factors and not pay enough attention to what's happening domestically.
Factors. I mean, from a trade perspective, there are many, exporters, both local and foreign, who are keeping their US dollar earnings outside the country and not wanting to bring them back, partly because of uncertainty in Malaysia, right? But since you brought up Bank Negara, I'll be a little bit naughty here. And we talked about your Chicago PhD and the kind of thinking that also was promulgated by prominent Chicago economists on rational expectations, right? So this is where I think we were in the UK when Tony Blair and Gordon Brown decided to give a lot more independence to the Bank of England.
First announcement they made.
Exactly, right. So that gave them, somewhat shield from the political pressures of wanting to, raise or lower interest rates depending on political expediency. Do you think that is an issue that's affecting Malaysia in terms of the executive wanting to impose its views and perhaps make unintentionally making people who are looking at the Malaysian market a little bit uneasy with regards to possible interference with our monetary policy?
So from my own experience, from what I see, it's a no. I don't see any political interference per se, but I will be fair. I've heard people say there is, but from my experience, it's a no. But just one final thing on the ringgit. I think I can totally understand why, of course, ringgit depreciation hurts many. Your ringgit doesn't go as much, but it is not the only metric of how to measure an economy's strength. So I do want to say that. And if I could sort of give my one sentence summary of how I feel about the Malaysian economy is that, Malaysia is never as bad as it seems. The economy is never as bad as it seems, but it is never as good as it can be either.
Apurva, I want to, for me, this is the last bit. It's a quick fire round. So I'm going to throw 4 questions at you, and it's not a one word answer. You can elaborate, but let's keep it tight. And I'm going to start with the ringgit first. So Cheryl and I just recently interviewed this guy. He's 98 years old right now. He has some experience in governance, and he served in the government before briefly. He says he did this in 1998. He pegged the ringgit. Should we peg the ringgit?
No. The world has moved on. Malaysia has learned a lot from the days of the Asian financial crisis. In particular, the banking sector is on much more terra firma, much more solid ground. So, and there's really no need to peg the ringgit. That would just send the wrong signals to the investor community.
Second quick fire question. Just before you came on, Kian Meng, Cheryl and I were talking about a cabinet reshuffle. This is about governance. I'm mindful that you don't want to touch on the politics of this country, but in terms of governance, should the Prime Minister also be the Minister of Finance in any country?
It depends. The classic economic
wow.
answer. Third question.
Moving on.
Okay. Third question, GST, yes or no?
A qualified yes. And let me elaborate on it because that's an important one. So we know that, we're talking earlier of how when you went with your proposal to Treasury, they would say, well, we don't have the funds. And the backdrop to that is if you look at Malaysia's revenue-raising capacity, and it's a well-known figure that has gone down drastically. Tax revenue GDP is now 12% compared to other countries, similar countries, where it's about 20%. So Malaysia clearly needs to... So the way I like putting it is Malaysia has gone down from a medium revenue, medium spending equilibrium to a low revenue, low spending equilibrium. But here's the rub, guys. Malaysia needs to spend more, not less. It needs to spend better, of course, plugging all the leakages and all that, but it needs to spend more. It's an aging society.
Healthcare spending.
Healthcare spending,
NIMP.
climate change, defense, given where the world is headed, so on and so forth. And for it to spend more, it needs to raise more. Right? So at some point, Malaysia will need to address what is the best way to raise more money. Now, it's a qualified yes, because GST comes with drawbacks, it's regressive, but there are ways to address it. But GST is, I've been on record previously saying, it's a lean and mean machine to raise revenues, but you have to address the regressivity issue.
Last one, on a A to F scale, grade the economic performance of this government thus far.
I'm not going to throw out any numerical grades. I think the current government is also facing a lot of legacy issues. The main issues in Malaysia are structural. And one thing we didn't touch upon, if I have the liberty of touching upon it, is what's happening subnationally. So we talk of Malaysia as one entity of unit of analysis. But if you think of it, where does future growth come from? It's really unlocking the potential of state-led growth. And Malaysia is a federation, but it's remarkable as a relative newcomer, it's a very tightly held federation, right? So the fact that if you have to build a school or a hospital in the remote areas of Sabah, you still have to go to Putrajaya in many ways to get permission. That is such a that needs to evolve. Let's put it that way. So, is it possible for me to ask you guys
Yes,
some
before
questions?
these guys wrap up, yeah, go ahead.
Okay,
Yeah.
and
Can I just say that seeing
yeah.
as to how you answered the 4 questions and skirted around some of the more controversial ones, you should consider a career in politics at some point. Anyway, go ahead.
Maybe not in India, but
So this is don't mind, yeah. So and feel free to edit it if you will. So before I came on the show, again, thanks very much for having me and thanks for entertaining me in English. But one common refrain I've heard about your show, which is incredibly successful, yeah, is that you two are privileged gentlemen running the show and shaping public opinion. Who sort of gave you this right, if I can use that word? I mean, it's not a right per se, but how do you reconcile your privilege with, spreading the word far? Or might you be biased in the way you look at things?
I think recognizing the privilege is where you begin. That's not just for the show, but I think in life one should. But once you do that, I think it's also trying to not compensate, but make sure that our views reflect our own experiences on the ground, which I think we have a bit of, right, considering our previous life, and also the conversations we have with ordinary people. And I think once you have that awareness and also that desire to ensure that your views and what we bring on the show truly reflect in a fair and equitable way what we think is right, then we go as far as we can to deal with that.
Fair enough. And the sort of last question at my end is that I did say gentlemen, and correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah. Can I just add to that?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, I mean, I don't, again, this might come off elitist, but there is a sense of noblesse oblige. Privilege, with privilege comes responsibility. That doesn't mean that if you are not privileged, you have no responsibility. Everyone does. But I think especially if you have had advantages and opportunities, you have to try your best to contribute. And we don't pontificate from our podcast. We don't lecture and hector people. Our express motto is actually to reduce the gulf in talking about current issues, political issues, economic issues, by speaking about them in very, very easy and using easy language. So I think it's one thing if we're very ideologically driven and trying to sell a particular worldview. We're interested in people's worldview. That's why we start with that question every time we interview someone. And we certainly don't peddle what we believe are our own biases. Of course, we are very opinionated people. That's for sure. Nobody has given us a right to do this. We are competing in a big marketplace.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, it's a marketplace of
it's
ideas.
A marketplace. Yeah, sure.
And Apurva, you said Malaysia is short on public intellectuals. So I don't think that people with previous opportunities or privileged people should surrender that opportunity to participate just because of that.
Fair enough. And you did notice in my question I said gentlemen, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you haven't had any women on the show yet.
We had one.
Oh, you did?
Okay.
Okay.
It's been a consistent bugbear for us.
Yes, it has.
In fact, we
have a list.
It's an
You have a list,
absolute internal turmoil for Sharil and I that we've not done enough.
Okay.
We had Amira Aisha, who's the now acting president of Muda.
Yes.
Sadiq's number 2. She's now stepped up. We want to get more. In fact, we've listed down a few, and we're reaching out.
So can I make a suggestion? I've seen this in other countries I've worked in interviews when you have things like this. You always ask an outgoing guest, like in this case me, who would I recommend who's not from my discipline or field? And maybe you can start that just as an idea. And
Sure.
if you were to start it, I have a recommendation.
Sure.
I recently came across Mazlan Othman, if I remember.
Yeah,
pronouncing that
astrophysicist.
correctly. Highly impressive. Malaysia's first female astrophysicist. So full of you know her better than I do. You know, get her to talk about innovation, about gender issues, about science. You were in Mosti, Khairi, so that's my recommendation.
No, it's good. It's a good pivot. I think we've been very politics focused, and unfortunately, there are increasing number of women involved in politics. But I think at the leadership level and those who we've, I suppose, interviewed, we've not had that opportunity. But now we want to move away from just politics.
broader.
And Tan Sri Mazlan is a great suggestion. Thank you for that.
So is
suggestion.
Azalina on the list? I just wondering.
She's not on the list. She's not on the list.
Okay, Kian Meng and Sharil, why don't you guys close this?
A couple of quick fire ones as well. Is Malaysia ready for carbon tax? If not, if yes, when? Because I know the World Bank is doing a bit of this.
It is getting ready. So it's not ready to have one tomorrow, but hopefully in a year plus, it should be ready.
Is Malaysia ready for some sort of a national health insurance program?
I think Malaysia needs an insurance program, especially for the informal workers and people who are outside the formal insurance. You can call it whatever, but yes. Okay. And there are moves towards that, I believe.
Are we ready this year to, and this will be my last one, to gradually reduce our petrol subsidies? Next year. Are we ready next year?
I really hope so. And the way I look at it is that in this budget, the fact that diesel and electricity have been marked for subsidy rationalization is a step for the elephant in the room, which is RON 95 subsidies.
I'll be a bit kinder, so not so much quick fire. Just maybe a quick one around.
I hope there's a Dylan question in there.
You can bake Dylan into the answer.
Okay.
Any thoughts, World Bank thoughts, your own thoughts around this push for degrowth, considering we've been talking this entire episode and most people talk about growth and how you get to growth, but I think we should address a bit briefly your thoughts on this alternative view that growth itself shouldn't necessarily be the goal for countries.
I agree. Growth is
climate.
So growth is a means to an end, and the end is ultimately improving the welfare. And if you're increasing your growth by burning down your forests or cutting down trees, that's the kind of growth I don't subscribe to. But I'm also not a fan of the degrowth movement. And give you one very practical example. When COVID struck, and it's not just Malaysia, but world over, in some ways you could argue that the world went through a degrowth phase. People were out of jobs, people were miserable. That's not the kind of world we would want to live in.
Okay, I think it's been great.
Apurva Sanghi, lead economist from the World Bank. Thank you for coming on Keluar Sekejap, and we hope to continue this conversation at some point in the future.
Thanks very much, guys. Look forward to being on the show again at some point if you wish.
Terima kasih kepada semua. Saya tahu episod yang agak panjang, tetapi feedback daripada episod dengan Tuan Dr. Mahathir, ramai juga listeners dan juga penonton Keluar Sekejap yang suka kepada episod yang panjang-panjang. Thank you guys. Thank you.
Terima kasih.